And welcome back, folks. I'm J.B. Shreve, your host at The End of History, where we help believers make sense of the world they live in with intelligent, faith-based perspectives of our times and the history that built those times. We are deep into this podcast series, The Empire, a 250-year American story. And in today's episode, we're going to continue our look at the American Revolution. This is some really fun stuff for all my fellow history nerds out there. In the last episode, we tried to get a handle on the scale, the scope of the fighting, removing the misunderstanding of many historical perspectives of a war that was all gentlemanly and civil. This was a revolution. It was just as violent, just as chaotic, just as terrible as any revolution we hear about today, from Africa to Asia to Latin America. Now, today we're going to look at the different zones of fighting in the war. A lot of the fighting started in the north. That's where most of the famous battles were fought. But most of the worst of the fighting, the worst of the violence, it actually took shape in the south. And that's the story we're going to look at today. I hope you're ready, and let's go ahead and dive in to today's episode entitled The Crucible.
This is the end of history.
A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies.
We believe that peace is at hand.
An axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Democracy and freedom for all. We must choose in this crucial moment of human history.
So we've already seen the opening shots of the fighting at Lexington and Concord. Now, the opening stages of this war, the American Revolution, the opening stages were deceptively successful, especially for the Continental Army. The full force of the British had not yet arrived. It wasn't organized. And frankly, the Americans weren't prepared for what they were encountering, or the British weren't prepared for what they were encountering among the Patriots in the northern colonies. But that early glow of victory for the Patriots, it masked the fragility of that Patriot cause. When the British assaulted Breed's Hill that June, later immortalized as the Battle of Bunker Hill in Boston, they took the ground from the Patriots only after suffering really heavy casualties. It was simply far more than the British ever anticipated from what they imagined as this ragtag army of militias among the colonists. And the hill fell when the colonists ran out of ammo. But the message was clear. The Americans could fight, but they lacked everything else. They lacked gunpowder. They lacked discipline, organization, a unified command. The British won the fight there at Bunker Hill, but many back home in Britain, they noted how many more of those kinds of victories would probably result in Britain losing the war itself. There were more than 1,500 casualties at Breed's Hill, Bunker Hill, with more than 1,000 of those on the British side of the fighting. Now, George Washington's arrival in Cambridge that summer, it brought order, but it didn't bring strength. The siege of Boston was more a standoff than a triumph. The Continental Army was a patchwork of short-term militias, men who came and went with the seasons. Disease ravaged the camps. Supplies were so scarce that Washington wrote, "We are at the end of our tether." That's what his own words. We're coming to the end of it all. And this sort of letter from Washington to the Continental Congress, it kind of became a recurring theme throughout the war. The Army lacked supplies. It lacked food. They lacked professional soldiers. And just about the time that Washington and his leaders got his troops trained up, their enlistment period would end, and the soldiers would go back home, forcing him to start all over again with new troops who were still outnumbered by the British. The one positive thing that Washington had was a small collection of extremely capable officers. These were men who had little background in the military, but the crucible of the fighting brought them to the forefront for their capabilities. Henry Knox is one of these guys. His rise to prominence before the American Revolution is one of the most remarkable stories in the Patriot leadership story itself. Born in Boston in 1750, Henry Knox was largely self-educated. After leaving school to support his family, he apprenticed in a bookstore and eventually opened his own shop. And that bookstore became his university. Knox devoured volumes on engineering, artillery, fortifications, and military history. And by his mid-20s, he possessed a deeper theoretical understanding of artillery than many professional officers of his day. And so Knox's strength were unusual for a man really with no formal military training. He combined intellectual curiosity with practical ingenuity, a calm temperament with enormous physical endurance, and most importantly, a gift for logistics. When the revolution began, he joined the Massachusetts militia, quickly impressing George Washington with his competence, with his steady judgment. His defining achievement came in the winter of 1775 to 76 when he proposed hauling captured cannon from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston. Now that task seemed impossible. 60 tons of artillery dragged across frozen rivers, mountains, across the wilderness, but Knox organized the entire operation. He negotiated with the locals. He improvised sleds. He kept the mission moving through brutal weather, and Washington later called it a noble train of artillery that Henry Knox was leading. Well, that feat transformed the siege of Boston. Once the guns were in place on Dorchester Heights, the British were forced to evacuate, and Knox's logistical brilliance, reliability, his quiet confidence made him essential to the Continental Army. Proof that intellect and determination could overcome the Revolution's chronic shortage and staggering odds. So the Continentals had scored a victory over the British, but it's not going to last too long. The British returned in overwhelming force that summer, landing tens of thousands of troops all around New York. And as the American forces abandoned New York, loyalists, hundreds of them, made a public declaration of dependence. Rather than the American Declaration of Independence, they made a declaration of dependence on the British, mocking the recent Americans' Declaration of Independence. At one point, as the Continental forces were pushed back, Washington blazed into the full fight with roaring with anger at his retreating soldiers. Some of his closest generals believed, as he's going into this fight that they're losing and his soldiers are running away from, some of his closest generals believed he was literally trying to be killed in the fighting. So reckless was his movement, his effort here. And honestly, that may have been what he was aiming for. Better to die an honorable death than suffer a dishonorable defeat. His men pulled him back, and Washington's life was spared, and the American escape secured from New York. Washington wanted to burn New York when he left. He wanted to burn the city to the ground so that the British would have no rewards. Well, the Congress refused to give him that permission. Nevertheless, this mysterious fire breaks out and burns hundreds of homes as the American forces are departing. The British were convinced it was Washington's doing. Washington always denied that he did it. The campaign that followed after New York nearly destroyed the Continental Army. Washington was outmaneuvered on Long Island. He was driven from Manhattan. He was chased across New Jersey. His army was shrinking by the day. Desertion, disease, expiring enlistments, they hollowed out Washington's army, the Patriot Army. And by December 1776, Washington commanded barely a few thousand men, many barefoot, many hungry, many demoralized. And British officers believed the rebellion was weeks from collapse by this point, the winter of 1776. And frankly, it was only the failure of the British generals to deliver the decisive blow that kept Washington's army alive and allowed them to escape. Like we said last time in the last episode, Washington didn't have to win the fight. He just had to avoid losing. The British, they were the ones who had to win the war itself. This delay on the side of the British army was noted by many on both sides of the fighting. For the British, they interpreted this as their ultimate victory over the Patriots being inevitable. It's going to happen. We don't have to rush this thing. For the Americans, they understood this as a sign that God was on their side, preserving Washington and his army for another day. The early victories of the Continental Army were soon wiped away by the British. Each victory on the map where a Patriot flag was proudly flown was soon replaced by a British flag and counter-victory as Washington was moved into an almost permanent posture of retreat. By December 1776, just months after the Declaration of Independence, the Continental Army was on the brink of disintegration. Washington had been driven from New York. He had been chased across New Jersey. He had been reduced to a few thousand exhausted, half-clothed soldiers whose enlistments were about to expire, and British commanders believed the rebellion, it's effectively finished. It's precisely then, when defeat seemed inevitable, that Washington made this gamble. He gambled for everything. And on Christmas night, 1776, in a freezing storm of sleet and ice, Washington led his army across the Delaware River. Now, this is where the famous and bogus painting of Washington crossing the Delaware comes from. I'll put a picture of it in the show notes on this episode at theendofhistory.net. The painting, created in 1851, it shows Washington proud and standing near the American flag as a boat full of men rushes across the ice-packed Delaware River. The truth is, there's no way he stood in that boat on this risky venture. This was a do-or-die effort, and he was certainly trying to manage every risk that he could in this scenario. The crossing itself was nearly impossible. Men slipped on frozen planks, artillery threatened to topple into the river, and the storm slowed the march to a crawl. Yet by dawn, on December 26th, the day after Christmas, the army reached Trenton and struck the Hessian garrison with speed and precision. The victory, it was small in numbers, but enormous in effect. It proved the army wasn't quite dead. Washington refused to let that momentum fade. With the British forces converging, he executed yet another daring maneuver, circling behind the enemy and marching overnight towards Princeton, New Jersey. And on January 3rd, 1777, the next week, his troops clashed with British regulars. When the American line wavered, Washington rode forward. He rallied the men under fire, and the British line broke. Now, these twin victories didn't win the war, but they did save it. In the bleakest moment, Washington transformed desperation into renewed hope, showing that resolve and audacity could overcome overwhelming odds, at least on these occasions. In New Jersey, most people were abandoning the Patriot cause by this point in the fighting. In a confidential letter Washington wrote to a friend at this time, he said, "Our affairs are in a very bad way. I think the game is pretty near up." That despair was spreading to Philadelphia, where people believed Washington could protect them, or they didn't believe that Washington could protect them from the advancing British Army. And they were right. The Continental Congress actually fled Philadelphia and set up shop in Baltimore. Several leading patriots fled the city and defected to the British, including leaders of the Army, leaders of the Congress, the American Congress. Other patriots in the city packed their belongings into wagons and fled, escaping as refugees. In September 1777, the British General William Howe captured and occupied Philadelphia, the acting capital of the American colonies. So things appeared dire, if not for the good news that came from the north. Washington and the army took Princeton and Trenton, but the general and the Continental Congress proved impotent in being able to protect their own capital. If you're enjoying this series on how the world works and the study of international relations, I think listeners out there who are liking this will really love a recent book I wrote entitled Politically Incorrect: Real Faith in an Era of Unreal Politics. If you've ever wondered how a person of faith is supposed to engage with our crazy political environment today, this is the book for you. It's not Republican, it's not Democrat. This is a biblical-based perspective of how politics works, and more importantly, how Christians ought to work within that system, and sometimes even against that system. We look at everything from our present political context to the history, the mistakes of the Christian right in America, and we'll bring it all home with some insight on how we, the Christian church, can best engage today. The book is Politically Incorrect: Real Faith in an Era of Unreal Politics by me, J.B. Shreve. You can find links for it at the website, theendofhistory.net, or you can go directly to Amazon and just drop it in your shopping cart. That's Politically Incorrect: Real Faith in an Era of Unreal Politics by J.B. Shreve. Now, Horatio Gates was a guy who entered the American Revolution with a resume unmatched by most Patriot officers. He was born in England, 1727. He served for decades in the British Army, fighting in the French and Indian War, and there he rose to the rank of major. He was competent, he was organized, he was deeply versed in military administration, skills the fledgling Continental Army desperately needed. And when he resigned his British commission, settled in Virginia, he carried with him both professional experience and this, I guess the nice way to say it is a keen sense of his own worth. Gates joined the Patriot cause early, and Congress quickly recognized his administrative strengths. Unlike Washington, who embodied battlefield leadership, Gates excelled at paperwork, supply management, turning chaos into order. He was ambitious, he was confident, sometimes thin-skinned, and traits that made him effective, but also politically calculating. He believed, not quietly by the way, that he deserved the high command. Right? He deserved Washington's place. He was frequently involved in whispering campaigns behind the scenes with members of the military and the Continental Congress to subvert General Washington and have himself appointed as the leader of the Continental Army. Now, this is the trend that Washington repeatedly had to concern himself with among the officers outside his inner circle. Very skilled men, but also very untrustworthy men. Gates's moment came in 1777. He was placed in charge of the Northern Department, and Gates inherited an army already positioned to resist General Burgoyne's advance, the British General Burgoyne's advance from Canada. This was the year that the British launched a grand strategy to sever New England from the rest of the colonies. New England, remember, was the radical territory. This was where Sam Adams, John Adams, the radicals of the Revolution were from. If they could cut off the snake's head, they thought they could take the rest of the colonies pretty easily. So the British General Burgoyne, he marched south from Canada, expecting to meet British forces moving north from New York. Instead, he found himself isolated. He found himself harassed, and ultimately, he found himself surrounded. And this was where General Horatio Gates entered the mix and won his claim to fame in the American Revolution. While much of the groundwork had been laid by another general, or two generals, Philip Schuyler and Benedict Arnold, Gates presided over the decisive battles at Freeman's Farm and Bemis Heights. The American victory at Saratoga, Burgoyne's surrender there, was the first major British capitulation of the war, and it convinced France to join the Patriot cause. Now, that wasn't realized at the time, but this was the thing that brought France over. This victory was what brought France over to the side of the Patriots, believing, yeah, these guys are legit, right? So Gates became the Revolution's most celebrated general, hailed as the hero of Saratoga. For all the success of Gates's victory, and it was undoubtedly an important victory, it did nothing good for his ego, and it risked a rupture within the ranks of the officers. Gates' supporters in Congress whispered that he, not Washington, should now lead the Continental Army. Washington became massively irritated by Horatio Gates following the victory, as the general failed to even inform the commander of the American Army of this victory for weeks. Weeks went by, and he didn't even send a messenger to tell Washington that he had won the battle. Washington actually heard about it from other people. It was a real sign of disrespect by Gates towards Washington, and Washington's not soon going to forget this. The American victory at Saratoga, it was stunning. Its greatest effect, like I said, was convincing the French to join and support the Americans. But that turn of events wouldn't be known for months. They wouldn't know that that the French were going to come over to their side. For now, it was just a great victory, but it didn't look like it would be enough to stop the suffering, the hemorrhaging on the side of the Continentals. The militia, the Continental forces alike, they suffered from shortages and internal rivalries. And by the end of the year, 1777, misery and doubts permeated the American cause, the American army. Strangely, and despite all this failure that seemed to be mounting around him, Washington was the locus point that held things steady. Remember, this is the key thing that Washington brought to the whole story, to the whole affair. Few Americans still had confidence in Washington and his army, but those who did would fight to the death for him. And so as the Continental Army settled for the winter of 1777 to 1778, the fighting's not supposed to take place in the winter, Washington set up his encampment at a place called Valley Forge, situated in the hills of Pennsylvania, less than 20 miles from the American capital city at that time, Philadelphia. Remember, the British are now occupying this city. He set camp here so he could, in theory, keep an eye on the British. In truth, there was little that his army could have done against the British if they had decided to become aggressive. The American army, it's almost wiped out by this point, right? It's almost done for. Valley Forge stands in American memory as both the nadir and the rebirth of the Continental Army, a place where the Revolution nearly collapsed and yet paradoxically found its unshakable core. When Washington's army trudged into the Pennsylvania hills in December 1777, They weren't the triumphant citizen soldiers of patriotic myth. They were exhausted. They were half-clothed. They were demoralized after this string of defeats all around Philadelphia. Congress was powerless, the states were slow to send supplies, and British forces wintered comfortably in the captured capital. So Valley Forge became the physical embodiment of the Revolution's fragility. A private in the American Army at that time by the name of Joseph Plum Martin, he described the arrival of the Continental Army to Valley Forge the week before Christmas as, and this is a quote, a cavalcade of wild beasts. 12,000 barefoot soldiers trailing a ribbon of blood as far as the eye could see. Even Washington wrote about the dismaying sight. He wrote, "To see men without clothes to cover their nakedness, without blankets, without shoes, by which their marches might be traced by the blood from their feet, is a mark of patience and obedience which, in my opinion, can scarcely be paralleled." When all the soldiers, camp followers, family visitors, when they were all counted together, Valley Forge during the winter, this famous and important winter, temporarily became the third largest city in the American colonies after Philadelphia and Boston. The suffering was real. Thousands lacked shoes. They left these bloody footprints in the snow that all these quotes are talking about. Disease swept through the encampment. Hunger gnawed at morale. Washington himself felt the weight of failure pressing in from all sides. Political rivals like Gates and others, they were whispering about replacing him. Foreign observers doubted the American experiment. And his own men, Washington's own men, questioned whether the cause was really worth all this misery. And if the revolution had a moment when it could have quietly died, it's right here. In fact, many did die right here. 2,000 men, nearly a fifth of the army, died during the winter of 1777 to 78, not at the hands of British gunfire, but from debilitating combinations of filth, exposure, malnutrition, and disease. And this is where another inaccurate but famous historical painting comes into play that often captures the images that many of us have at Valley Forge. The prayer at Valley Forge, it shows, that's this famous painting that was made in 1976. It depicts a kneeling Washington in the snow. It emphasizes his reliance on divine guidance during the winter of 1777 to 78, highlighting his role as a spiritual leader. Like I said, this one's newer. It was created in 1976 for America's bicentennial celebration, and it symbolizes American patriotism, portraying Washington seeking guidance during a critical, desperate moment, probably the most desperate moment of the Revolutionary War. The thing is, as the historian Joseph Ellis writes, it never happened. Washington was not anti-faith, but he was never, ever public about his personal faith. He never even joined a church, as his wife did. He was never known to pray publicly, and his stoic nature, for which he is best known, would have certainly prevented him from ever being caught in a public posture of prayer like this, even in the desperate moments like Valley Forge. But Valley Forge was a major turning point for the American side of the war. If you're a person of faith, and I am, I have to believe there were good things that God was doing in the hearts and minds of these soldiers as they suffered together through this brutal winter. Valley Forge, in a way, forged the army that would ultimately win the war. The Crucible didn't simply harden the soldiers, it transformed them. Washington's leadership, his steady, dignified, unyielding leadership, became the moral center of the encampment. He walked among the huts. He shared the hardships and held the army together, again, by his force of character. And in practical terms, the turning point actually came with the arrival of this guy named Baron von Steuben. Now, Baron von Steuben was in his mid-40s when he arrived to Valley Forge. He was born in Prussia. He grew up in the shadow of Frederick the Great's army, where even the toddlers probably marched in formation, is what some people said. Young Frederick learned early that military life was equal parts discipline and equal parts flair and the ability to shout instructions loudly enough to be heard across a battlefield or across a small country. He served in the Prussian army during the 7 Years' War. He gained a reputation as a capable officer and, more importantly, as someone who could make complicated drills sound almost fun. So after the 7 Years' War, he bounced around Europe collecting titles, collecting friends, and the occasional rumor, all the while trying to secure a job worthy of his impeccable posture. He was an openly gay military man. And by the time of the American Revolution, he was actually on the run from a scandal in his homeland that accused him of being a pedophile. So here you go. We've got all this. You hear that in the news today with rumors and conspiracy theories about pedophiles. Here we have one at the very opening of the American story. We've got this guy who's running from a pedophile scandal. Well, by the mid-1770s, von Steuben found himself unemployed, underappreciated, and overqualified. History's most dangerous combination, some people believe. Enter Benjamin Franklin, who took one look at this flamboyant Prussian drill master and thought, hey, perfect, let's send him to Washington, right? And so with his false title of Baron, he didn't actually have that title. He had a beloved greyhound and a talent for theatrical instruction. Von Steuben sailed for America, ready to whip the Continental Army into shape, and unintentionally he became a legend there. It was von Steuben who took the remaining remnants of Washington's army and began shaping them into a disciplined corps. He barely spoke English except a few curse words, which he employed liberally throughout his training of the soldiers. He usually employed those curse words incorrectly in the wrong order, sparking a wave of laughter among the troops he was training. Under his instruction, ragged volunteers became a cohesive fighting force capable of standing toe-to-toe with the British regulars. And so by the spring of 1777, or 1778, the army that marched out of Valley Forge was fundamentally very different from the one that limped in, that drug in 1777 in the winter. It was smaller, it was leaner, and it was tempered by shared suffering. And the men who had discovered a collective identity rooted not in fleeting enthusiasm, but in endurance. Washington had proven that he could hold the center even when everything around him seemed to be falling apart. And the revolution itself had survived its darkest winter. Although greatly diminished in size, the core of Washington's army would now exist and operate with far greater effectiveness from this point forward. Even among Washington's inner circle, there was a new definition of certainty and resoluteness in their allegiance, not only to the American cause, but to Washington, the father of the nation, as he would become to himself. Now, my favorite kind of history is not about timelines or dates or honestly even the battles necessarily. I like to know about the stories. I like to know about the characters. And to me, when you dig into the characters of this thing I keep referring to as George Washington's inner circle, it's really some fascinating guys. George Washington's inner circle included men like Nathaniel Greene. Now, as I've mentioned, Washington was not the greatest of generals. His skills lay elsewhere, but he had a knack for putting competent men all around him, men who would have been overlooked in the British Army. And Nathaniel Greene was at the top of that list. Nathaniel Greene didn't begin life looking like one of George Washington's most trusted generals. Born in 1742 to a really strict Quaker family in Rhode Island, he grew up in a world where, well, he's a Quaker. War was frowned upon. Dancing was suspicious, and fun was probably considered a gateway sin. Yet Greene had this restless mind. He devoured books on mathematics, philosophy, and quietly, secretly, on military science, which wasn't exactly on the Quaker-approved reading list. When he inherited his family's iron forge, Nathaniel Greene tried to play the respectable businessman for a while, but politics pulled him in. And by his early 30s, he was a rising voice in the Patriot movement, arguing that liberty was worth defending, even if it meant disappointing every pacifist ancestor he'd ever had. When the Rhode Island militia formed, Greene joined, despite a limp that made some officers question whether he could even march. He responded by outworking everyone. This guy was the real deal. If you want to go deeper, if you want to dig deeper into and read a biography on just one of these characters, one of the under-recognized heroes of the American Revolution, I highly recommend you find one that covers the life of Nathaniel Greene. The Continental Congress soon noticed the unexpected competence of this guy. Washington noticed even faster. Greene rose from the militia private to a major general in record time, proving himself calm under fire during the New York and New Jersey campaigns. And by the winter of 1777 to 1778, Greene arrived at Valley Forge as Washington's indispensable problem solver, part quartermaster, part strategist, part miracle worker. He was ready to help hold the army together when everything seemed ready to fall apart. Another key player in George Washington's inner circle, Alexander Hamilton, Washington's secretary, who would end up exerting enormous influence on the birthing of the American nation in the years ahead. Hamilton's early life reads like the opening chapter of a novel that no one would believe if it weren't true. He was born a bastard in the Caribbean around 1755 or 1757, depending on which version he preferred to tell. And Hamilton grew up amid hurricanes, hardships, and the kind of poverty that forges either despair or brilliance. Well, he chose brilliance. And by his teens, he was running a merchant house, writing prose so fiery that local leaders took up a collection to send him to the mainland of the United States, or it wasn't the United States at that point, but the mainland colonies, before he accidentally became governor of these islands. He arrived in New York in 1772, and Hamilton, he devoured knowledge at King's College, threw himself into revolutionary politics with such enthusiasm of a man who had absolutely nothing to lose. And he didn't really, because he had nothing to fall back on. Pamphlets, speeches, debates, he was everywhere, arguing for liberty with a pen sharp enough to draw blood. And when war came, Hamilton traded books for artillery. He raised a company. He fought with precision and daring. He caught George Washington's eye, of course, and by 1777, he was invited onto Washington's staff, becoming the general's indispensable aide-de-camp, equal part strategist, equal part secretary, and equal part intellectual sparring partner. By the winter, at Valley Forge, Hamilton stood at the heart of the Continental Army's brain trust, young, brilliant, and already impossible to ignore. Then there's this guy, John Lawrence, barely in his 20s when America declared its independence. Lawrence had every advantage. He's the opposite of Hamilton. He had every advantage that colonial aristocracy could provide. His father, Henry Lawrence, was one of the wealthiest slave traders in North America. An irony that would define John's life because from a young age, he developed the inconvenient habit of believing slavery was morally indefensible. Now, this made family dinners spirited, to say the least. His father was also an active member of the Continental Congress, even serving as its president and becoming a key figure and diplomat for the American cause. Well, the son, John Lawrence, was educated in London. And Lawrence, he studied the Enlightenment ideals with the intensity of a man who planned to use them immediately. He studied law, he read philosophy, he cultivated a reputation for boldness that really bordered on recklessness. When the revolution erupted, he abandoned his legal training, he sailed home, and he determined to trade his powdered wigs for gunpowder. And once in the Continental Army, Lawrence became known for a kind of elegant bravado, charging into danger with the confidence of someone who had never once doubted his purpose. In fact, when Lawrence died near the end of the war, it was by leading a charge in this meaningless battle on the Southern Front. He was shot from his horse and he died before he even hit the ground. And those close friends, those friends within Washington's inner circle, although mourning the news of his death, they noted that the ending of John Lawrence's life was inevitable. It was how he lived and was certainly how he expected how he would have died. Lawrence became part of the general's inner circle, Washington's inner circle, admired for courage and his mind. And by the winter at Valley Forge, he was already pushing his most radical idea of them all. He wanted to form a black regiment by offering enslaved men freedom in exchange for service. It was audacious. It was idealistic. It was decades ahead of its time for the young American nation at this time. And just like Lawrence himself, it all fit for the moment. It was also something that both John's father, Henry, and George Washington himself thought was impossible to get approved in his home state of South Carolina. Well, they're both right here, all right? Last up, and what may be considered the most unlikely of Washington's inner circle, was the Marquis de Lafayette. To this day, his name is sprinkled across America in the names of towns and cities like Fayetteville. There are several states that have cities of Fayetteville, all named after this guy right here. Young, like Lawrence, he was only 20 years old when he joined Washington's staff in 1777. Lafayette was born into one of France's oldest noble families, a pedigree that practically guaranteed a life of comfort, ceremony, and well-polished boots. But Lafayette was never built for this quiet privilege. He wanted more. Orphaned young, he was raised among aristocrats who prized duty and honor, and he developed this romantic streak a mile wide, one that made the American Revolution look less like a distant conflict and more like destiny that was calling his name. When he heard whispers of people fighting for liberty, Lafayette didn't hesitate. He bought his own ship. He defied the king. He sailed across the Atlantic at age 19, arriving in Philadelphia with enthusiasm, broken English, and a letter of introduction that would change his life. We'll enter George Washington right here in the story. Their first meeting in 1777, it sparked one of the most remarkable relationships of the era. Washington, 25 years older and carrying the weight of a fragile nation on his shoulders, saw in Lafayette a sincerity, a courage that cut through the young man's aristocratic shine. Lafayette, in turn, found in Washington the father figure he had longed for ever since he became an orphan. Steady, principled, quietly affectionate beneath the formality. Ron Chernow, in his biography of Washington, he notes that Washington was probably sterile. He had no sons of his own. Well, this helped him politically in the years that followed the American Revolution, as if he had had children, people might have feared a potential monarchy with the father of the country. But if there was ever anyone who was truly like a son to Washington, it was Lafayette, according to Ron Chernow. Washington welcomed him onto his staff, and Lafayette pledged loyalty with the fervor of a son. They fought together at Brandywine, where Lafayette was wounded and Washington kept vigil. They strategized, they argued, they laughed, they endured the grinding uncertainty of war side by side. By the time the army settled into the brutal winter at Valley Forge, Lafayette and Washington's bond, it was just unbreakable. Lafayette refused offers to return to France. He chose instead to share Washington's hardships through that winter. And in the cold, hungry encampment, the young French nobleman became not just an ally, but he became family. Washington's adopted son, as many said, and one of the Revolution's most devoted champions. Hey folks, I'm J.B. Shreve, and if you've followed this podcast, this blog, for any length of time, you know that one of the things I love is a deep dive into truth and to Scripture. I love to find application for my life in the here and now. Well, that's what my latest book represents. It's titled David, Poet, Warrior, King, and it's a deep dive into the biblical account of King David's life. If you think you know the story already, you might want to check again. This is more than the giant killer, more than the king, more than the guy who sinned with Bathsheba. This is a biblically based, factual account of the legend King David that towers over Scripture really like no one else does. This is one of the most enjoyable books I've written so far. What we do, we track David's origins, the early years in the fields, and ask questions that most people either ignore or miss when it comes to his family. We look at his life as an outlaw on the run from King Saul. We go into the kingdom years and how things actually began to fall apart after his moral failing. And in the background of all of these epic stories is the big question: why did God like this guy so much? If you haven't read the book yet, I want to encourage you, go get your copy today. You can find the links at the website, theendofhistory.net, or just go to Amazon and put it in your shopping cart today. David, Poet, Warrior, King by J.B. Shreve. This book was written for those who love studying Scripture, who want to go deeper, but also for those just discovering God's truth. David, Poet, Warrior, King. It'll leave a mark on your soul when you're finished reading it. Now, before we conclude this episode, there's one more key part of this period of the Revolution that I want to make sure we cover. Because by the time Washington and his army departed Valley Forge in June of 1778, they were encountering a terrain of the Revolution that had begun to shift quite dramatically. Not only had the army become more centralized, the Patriot Army, not only had it become better trained, better disciplined, but the political environment had also changed drastically. General Gates' victory at Saratoga proved incredibly important. not only militarily but also diplomatically, as it helped convince the French to join the fighting. That effort had begun a long time before Gates's victory at Saratoga, though. At the heart of this effort, there was this handful of individuals who understood that the war just could not be won without another European nation supporting them. Benjamin Franklin was the indispensable figure. Arriving in Paris in 1776, he became a sensation. His plain dress, his wit, his reputation as a philosopher, scientist, statesman made him wildly popular among the French elites. And Franklin used his celebrity strategically. He cultivated influential figures such as France's foreign minister. The French foreign minister already saw the American Revolution as a chance to weaken Britain, France's old rival. But the French government needed proof that Americans could survive. Franklin's charmed open doors offensive, but American endurance kept them open. And John Adams and Arthur Lee, they also played roles in France, although often more combative than diplomatic. Still, their presence signaled that the Americans were serious about forging a formal alliance. Meanwhile, you've got this stunning defeat of General Burgoyne at Saratoga, and that provided the evidence that France needed. Saratoga proved the Americans were not a lost cause. They could win battles against British regulars if they were just resourced properly. French motivations were both ideological and strategic. Enlightenment ideals made the American struggle appealing to many French thinkers who saw it as a test of liberty against tyranny. But the deeper motive was really geopolitical. France wanted to avenge its loss in the 7 Years' War, what we usually call in America the French and Indian War. They wanted to diminish British power. So supporting the Americans offered a low-risk, high-reward opportunity. At least that's how it seemed in the beginning. In 1778, after months of negotiation, France formally recognized the United States and signed the Treaty of Alliance. It was a turning point. French money, ships, and soldiers, it transformed the war, and making eventual American victory possible. It also turned the American Revolution really into a world war of sorts. Eventually, the Spanish and the Dutch would join in the fighting against the British. As a world war, the fighting in the colonies now became only one front of that war, and after 1778, it increasingly became a significantly less important front. This is the way the historian Joseph Ellis described what was happening. In his book, The Cause, he writes, "The American theater was not being abandoned, but it was being relegated to the periphery of a global war in which France was the chief opponent. The British Navy, not the Army, was made the proverbial point of the spear, and the epicenter of the conflict moved from North America to the Caribbean. British imports from the West Indies were valued at £3 million, twice the value of imports from the American colonies. So as the French began to engage the British military strategy in the Revolution to stop it early, now it had proven a failure. Now there was the danger of France invading England itself. And to that end, Britain had to realign its forces. More important than the struggle for independence in America was the security of British trade, which is already being stressed due to the expenses of the war. When it came to trade, the economy of the Caribbean was far more important than that of the 13 colonies. This is a fact that most of us miss. We get so focused on the American Revolution. We think of America the way we do today. And at that time, the Caribbean was far more important to British trade. To that end, the British moved the bulk of their forces south, away from New York, away from Boston, and toward the Carolinas, where they could better defend the areas of Florida and the West Indies. Now, significantly, this is also where America's slave economy was based. The further south one went, the darker, the more dependent the American society and economy was on black African slaves. Now, we're going to stop right here for this episode. I want to pick up this story, but give it to the time and space it needs. In our next episode, we're going to turn our focus to the southern and western theaters of the American Revolution. We're going to look specifically on the concerning contradiction of America's fight for freedom while they enslaved Africans, even within that fight. Now that and a whole lot more is coming in our next episode in this series, The Empire, a 250-year American story. I'm J.B. Shreve, your host at the End of History, where we help believers make sense of the world they live in with intelligent, faith-based perspectives of our times and the history that built those times. Watch for the next episode in this series to drop in the coming days.
Check out more episodes at iTunes and wherever you download quality podcasts. Join us online at theendofhistory.net for articles and essays from the end of history. Follow JB on Twitter at JB_Shreve. The End of History is produced by Windmill Media.